You sit at the back of the starting grid. 19 identical Formula cars perched in front, ready. You stand on the clutch as your right foot pulsates the throttle. The tachometer bouncing in response, the smell of racing fuel permeates your senses. 160 horsepower rumble behind your seat, flexing the frame of your light Formula car with each revolution. 10 laps the distance to make your mark. The vision of turn 1 flashes before your eyes. And suddenly, the lights are lit. You hold your breath. Racing glory awaits. Revs is a Formula 3 racing simulator, published by Acorn Soft in 1984 for the 8-bit BBC Micro home computer. It was the racing simulator, arguably the first of its type, and coded by the brilliant British developer who went on to achieve legendary status, Geoff Crammond. While its visuals and gameplay may seem archaic compared to the Sims of today, Revs established a model for which all racing sims of the future would build upon. And looking past the heavily pixelated facade, you may discover it's not as foreign as you might expect. So, in this video, a thorough look at Revs. We will attempt to fully understand and appreciate the sim and its impact. We will learn when and where it came from, how it was developed, what made it unique and timeless, and how it established the sim racing genre as we know it today. The 1980s began as the 70s had ended. At the arcade. The arcades were home to the best games, with the best graphics. From Galaga, Asteroids, and Donkey Kong, to Space Invaders and Pac-Man. The lines stretched out the door, and the quarters stacked to the ceilings. For those with the need for speed, there was one answer: pole position. Namco's 1982 racer, Pole Position, defined what a racing game could be at the arcade. High speed, fast action, lightning reflexes, and addicting, non-stop gameplay. The raster scanning graphic techniques brought an unprecedented graphical fidelity, and most importantly, a high frame rate, to further the addicting impression of speed. On its surface, the game was simple: a steering wheel, pedals, a shifter. Keep the car on the road and go fast. But Pole Position was more than a mindless expanse of snaking tarmac. It simulated a Formula 1 race at the Fuji Speedway in Japan, complete with qualifications.
Prepare to qualify.
Players first had to set a lap in time trial to make the race. Too slow and your turn is over. Insert more credits. Under 73 seconds, you make one of the 8 positions on the starting grid. In under 60 seconds, you've attained the game's namesake. After qualifications, the player faced off against 7 CPU opponents and the clock over a 4-lap race. Avoid the competitors, puddles, road signs, and complete the laps as fast as possible. Pole Position challenged players' skills, allowing some who developed the knack to set a new top time and claim high score. But for many young gamers, it was purely the thrill of gripping a steering wheel for the first time, mashing the pedals and controlling your destiny. Add the spice of randomness from AI, and Pole Position quickly became the whole reason to visit the arcade. Mom, I'm going racing. Namco struck a deal with Atari for global distribution, and Pole Position soared to success as the top arcade game in the world 2 years running, 1983 and 1984. Although Pole Position and Pole Position 2 made no claims at being an authentic racer, some wanted more, and the burgeoning micro home computer industry was beginning to make some noise. In 1982, the home computer market was abuzz with a flood of new hardware. In the UK, Sinclair Development released the ZX Spectrum. and an investment from the state brought Acorn Computing's BBC Micro to eager bedroom programmers. Globally, the Commodore 64 reigned supreme, defining what a home computer really was. Almost overnight, an industry was born. And what started as an imitation of the arcade quickly grew bigger and more creative. At first, enthusiasts developed clones of popular arcade titles such as Space Invaders and Asteroids. But quickly these gave way to more complex and thought-out home gaming experiences. 1983's Jetpack by Ultimate Play the Game was one of the earliest to demonstrate home computer games could be as good as the arcade. Realistic physics implementation allowed players to operate a floating astronaut, capturing canisters of fuel to power their spacecraft and rocket away. David Braben and Ian Bell changed the whole industry with their 1984 classic Elite, bringing you into the cockpit of a spacecraft, allowing players to explore a galaxy as if they were the pilot themselves in mind-blowing 3D. Countless lived out their Han Solo fantasy, finding ways to make money while staying alive and giving birth to a genre which persists to this day: the space trucking simulator. Space was a common subject for games of this time. Perhaps it was the marriage of technology and what many considered to be a fitting subject for video games. Or more likely, it was the ease at which a convincing depiction of space could be rendered. Space afforded the unique benefit to gaming in the 8-bit era in that the realistic rendering of stars and minimalist spacecraft could be achieved with the meager 1 MHz processors and 32K of RAM of the time. But it wasn't long until 3D pushed into something more terrestrial. Checkered Flag was Scion Software's 1983 entry for the first-person Formula Racer on the ZX Spectrum. Developed by Steve Kelly, the game allowed players to lap 6 real Formula 1 circuits in 3 different Formula cars. The games Ferretti and McFaster took obvious inspiration from their real 1982 F1 counterparts. But for gamers of the time, they provided well enough the impression of driving one of the real cars themselves, if not only for creative licensing. The game was praised for its realistic driving view, and publication Your Spectrum highlighted the accurate view of the car and smooth scrolling as remarkable features. Another review in Crash Magazine, one of the key ZX Spectrum publications of the time, also reviewed the game favorably.
You can see the nose of your car with the wheels turning and the steering wheel. I was a bit worried that there were no hands on the steering wheel.
The driving and graphical fidelity were all there, but the game lacked one major component, maybe the most important aspect to auto racing: the competition. Checkered Flag, possibly in an attempt to manage performance or perhaps due to the lack of development time, only included time trial modes. The omission of raceable AI was unfortunate, but understood by reviewers of the time. Anyways, players setting the best lap times still provided hours of enjoyment. No other racing games had so effectively portrayed racing a vehicle, allowing players to enter the cockpit of the car themselves and navigate the same circuits as their F1 heroes did. Perhaps having realistic AI was just too much to ask for systems of the time. The unpredictable and erratic opponent cars relegated to the arcade. But some others thought not, and they set out to prove it. Of all the bedroom programmers of the UK, there are none more famous to racing simulation history than Geoff Crammond. A university graduate with a formal degree in physics, Crammond found himself working at the British telecommunications company Marconi in the late 70s developing optimization software. The position with Marconi offered exposure to computers at a time when just having 32 kilobytes of RAM required a dedicated room of machines humming away. Crammond, in his 20s at the time, found enjoyment with computer development. And as technology was progressing, so was his imagination. In 1981, Geoff found himself at a computer show in Olympia, where he laid eyes on Acorn Computer's BBC-backed creation, the BBC Micro. Geoff had been dreaming up the idea of making his own 3D flying simulator, and this seemed like the machine which could do it. He pre-ordered a unit on the spot and eagerly awaited its arrival. The BBC Micro was one of the many new affordable microcomputers entering the home market. Its original application was meant to be the schools, and although in education it proved successful, the 32K of RAM, relatively high-speed 2 MHz 6502 processor, and BBC Basic coding language with built-in graphics proved to be a relative powerhouse for game development. Sitting down with his brand new micro, Jeff shelved his flight simulator idea in favor for something more simplistic to learn the machine: a clone of the then contemporary Space Invaders. Although the BBC Basic language made programming quicker and easier for the masses, Jeff noticed it wouldn't perform as well as he needed for high-speed graphics. He decided to teach himself assembly code and develop more directly with the machine. Kremen's Space Invaders clone took shape, and it accurately replicated what he saw in the arcade. It came together so successfully, in fact, he thought he might publish it. While looking at other ads for BBC Micro games, Jeff noticed that Acornsoft, the software arm of Acorn Computers, was not selling a clone of Space Invaders in their lineup of games. Excited, he went to Acornsoft's offices in Cambridge to see if they were interested in his creation. Needless to say, by the end of the meeting, the BBC Micro now had an official Space Invaders clone, the aptly dubbed Super Invaders. With game success and royalties rolling in, Acornsoft asked Kremen what he would like to make next. Now, with full creative freedom, Jeff could focus on what he originally dreamed to make: a flight simulator. Aviator would be the name of Jeff Kremen's 3D foray into the skies. For the next year, Jeff fully exercised his physics degree and programming skills. Calculating the forces of an airplane and rendering a full 3D environment were not exactly commonplace in 1983. Kremen previously had no formal training in flight, so he studied aircraft manuals to learn the basic concepts and develop a means to simulate them. In a stroke of nationalism, Aviator's plan of choice was to be the World War II Spitfire, catapulting eager Brits into the skies over the fictional town of Acornsville, complete with river and bridge crossing. The romanticism of flight was in full force. What Jeff made was remarkable. Rendered in minimal wire graphics and mostly barren landscape, the game astonished reviewers for what could be accomplished on a system limited by 32K of RAM. Gamers of the time noted the Sims' difficulty and steep learning curve, but once mastered, allowed them to soar as high as computer-induced imagination allowed.
Approaching the town, you realise the full extent of the superb graphics. At first, the entire town is just a small dot on the artificial horizon, but as you approach, it becomes a number of dots, one for each building. Then, as you get closer still, you can distinguish between the buildings. Come too close, and you'll crash into the building. Fly between them, and you can score points.
It really cannot be described how impressive the black and white pixel shapes were to enthusiasts in 1983. In front of you, at your home computer, you could explore the sky, flying the same Spitfire your uncle told you stories about. You could take off and land. You could dive under a bridge. You could do a barrel roll. You could even battle aliens. The realism added to the sensation of flight. The first-person perspective made you the pilot. Aviator was onto something big, but now the action was set to come back to Earth. Hot off the heels of Aviator, Acornsoft now had an assignment for their new programmer, Savant. Acorn Computers was at the time an active sponsor of F1 star James Hunt's younger brother, David Hunt, and his Eddie Jordan British Formula 3 effort. Kremen was tasked with taking his physics and 3D skills from the sky to the track. Where many developers would have cashed in and written a simple arcade game, Kremen took full control of the opportunity afforded to him. Because of the sponsorship, Acornsoft were given full access to Eddie Jordan Racing and driver David Hunt as they tested at Thruxton and Silverstone in 1983. For Jeff, this was a new world. He was unfamiliar with racing at the time, but he was prepared to lean in with an eager ear and learn what made the sport more than going in circles. The goal? Simple. To take what the experience of driving a Formula car around Silverstone was like and replicate it as accurately as possible for the home computer. Surely after mastering the nuances of simulating an aircraft, creating a virtual Formula car should be easy, right? To begin, Kremen hopped in a BMW with Hunt to experience laps at racing pace.
That experience made me realise that racing cars on a track was unrecognisable as an activity compared with driving a car on the road. My recollection is one of incredible G-forces and the feeling of being continually in a slide all the way around the circuit.
Jeff was impressed to find the techniques of driving a racing car at speed were more than just simply steering with foot mashed against the floorboard. The floating and control of weight made an immediate impression.
I was amazed at the way David was able to feel the balance of the car, and he showed me how he could steer with the throttle instead of the steering wheel.
Upon finishing the laps, Jeff noted looking at the tires of the BMW and noticing how they had become beveled from all the sliding. Simulating tires themselves would be a must. They're the only thing that touches the road. Translating the forces and movements he felt to simulation proved more difficult than the flight simulation of Aviator had been. The car's contact with the road was much more visceral than an airplane's trajectory through the air. To make a compelling simulation would require a new degree of fidelity and feedback to the player, namely a high refresh rate to capture the sense of speed and allow fast calculations to provide instantaneous feedback. The vehicle itself would be modeled after the same Formula 3 car raced by the Jordan team, the Ralt RT3. The RT3 was the seminal F3 car throughout the 80s. First designed in 1979 and incorporated ground effects pioneered just a season earlier in Formula 1 into the latter series. A design which would race and remain competitive throughout the entire decade. The cars were light, weighing just 455 kilos or 1,000 pounds. Empowered with a Toyota Straight 4, they produced upwards of 160 horsepower at 5,800 RPM, easily allowing the cars to lap Silverstone with the newly added wood-coach chicane at under a minute and 24 seconds, just 20 seconds slower than contemporary F1 cars. Another crucial development, the circuit. Kremen recognized early on that track design itself was often overlooked in other racing games. A crucial part to accurately creating a sim was to fully model a track, so that it felt like a real place. After all, what would racing practice be if you could not predict the corners and perfect your lines? Kremen sought to let the players arrive at corners in a 3D space, in an area which would be navigable as you would in real life, in full 3D. For as much as the car was the star, the circuit was also just as important. Most appropriately, Silverstone, the home of motorsport in England, was chosen to be replicated as the sole racing venue in the sim. So finally, Jeff began what would extend into a year of full-time development. First was to build a complete 3D rendition of Silverstone, complete with curbing and braking markers. Hills and elevation were planned from the start as well, despite Silverstone having minimum elevation change, a feature missing in most racing games of the time. And to navigate the space accurately, analog controls would be a must. Although the sim would be completely playable on the keyboard, full analog joystick support meant that steering could be smooth and precise. Although steering wheels did not yet exist outside the arcade, the move from simple keys to a joystick with smooth range of motion furthered the impression of a real simulation. Kremen strived to make a sim where it was compelling enough, just as in real life, for drivers to try, lap after lap, for that one extra tenth. David Hunt gave feedback on early versions of the sim, and helped Kremen narrow in on physics and controls which felt natural. The car would dive, going into corners as the suspension compressed, and would raise as it accelerated out of them and unloaded. Aerodynamics would be adjustable to allow players to develop a setup as the real drivers did. The sim was taking shape. A young Brazilian driver named Ayrton Senna had just won the British Formula 3 Championship in 1983. And although the world outside of racing circles had not yet heard his name, Jeff Kremen was about to enable thousands to try their best to imitate him. Jeff Kremen's new landmark simulation, titled simply Revs, was released after a full year of development in late 1984. The advertisement read, "Leave the rest behind. To play is to believe." Inch by inch, the fastest Grand Prix circuit in the world has been converted into colorful, 3D graphic game of nerve and skill to challenge the most competent and courageous of drivers. With evocative cover art by famous British artist Philip Castle, curious gamers were drawn to the idea of speeding around a Grand Prix circuit, duking it out corner after corner, head-to-head with a competent opponent, all from their home computer in stunning cutting-edge detail. But despite the obvious emphasis on challenge, gamers at the time were not quick to recognize the unprecedented sophistication of Crammond's sim. Those who wished to hop in and attack the track like they did in pole position were quickly humbled. The reality of such a complex simulation was surprising to some, and Revs quickly earned a reputation for difficulty.
The visuals are astonishing for their time. No one had yet seen a Formula cockpit display on screen, but by God, it was rock hard. You had to master steering, accelerating, and trying to do the gears. Most people gave up whilst being stuck in the pit lane.
Soon, sentiment grew that realism came with the cost of difficulty. Revs, much like driving a real Formula car, could not be mastered in mere minutes. Perhaps unfairly, part of the difficulty was exacerbated by controls. Although Jeff had focused on his implementation of innovative analog joysticks, the joysticks themselves in 1984 were still a rare luxury. Most tried the game on the keyboard, a contortion of commands for steering, upshifts, downshifts, gas, brake, clutch, and starter. But for those who persevered through, starting the car, leaving the pit lane, making their first corner, first lap, first 5 laps, racing with competitors, each milestone was rewarding. The addiction soon kicked in. The sim made no hesitations in communicating its complexity. Upon launching, each time players were brought through a myriad of full-text pages explaining the keyboard commands, the definition of a Formula 3 car, the basic controls available to the driver, shifting gears, prescribed wing angles, the inner workings of a rev counter, proper power band RPMs, the rules of qualifications, methodology of testing setup changes, race procedures, the rules of passing and outbraking your opponents, and finally, racecraft. Light reading for those longing to go fast. Most likely skip the debrief, or simply copy down controls and would figure it out for themselves. How hard could racing be? Even with proper controls, the answer was pretty difficult. Jeff's sim expected its players to learn as if they were aspiring to be a racing driver. The same concepts which governed real racing applied here too. Making a lap may be possible with brute force and mashing of the keys, clumsily finding the edges of the circuit, zigzagging around like an abandoned shopping cart rolling down a hill. But to go fast, the player would really have to understand the principles of racing. To aid with this and complement the game's wall of text startup sequence, included in the box were 2 separate informational manuals, the Driver's Handbook and the Silverstone Revs Racing Program. The handbook went into further detail on the car, the controls, qualifying procedures, and racing etiquette. Special detail was given to explaining the physics implications of aerodynamics on a race car, and the influence wing adjustments had on top speed, cornering, and balance. These days, the manual still serves as a great introduction to topics for anyone interested in driving a racing car, simulator or not. But in 1984, and being the first sim of its kind, this was essential and groundbreaking. The racing program, on the other hand, served as a history and introduction of Silverstone, and a corner-by-corner guide on lines, braking points, entry speed, and gear selections. Perhaps the most interesting inclusion, a full app walkthrough of Silverstone by David Hunt himself.
I obviously used the entire exit curb on the way out of Stowe, scrabbling back on the circuit with 5,200 RPM on the clock. I stay on the left-hand side with the tractor club corner and arrive with 5,700 RPM, staying relaxed as I work up the courage to turn into and through this 5th gear bend, staying absolutely on full noise throughout.
Now equipped with knowledge, applying the concepts learned led to market improvement and enjoyment of the simulator. An evening spent with Revs and its documentation only increased the impression of those who would give it a chance, quickly moving it from scary and difficult to realistic and exhilarating. Finally, after spending countless hours of practicing and learning the nuances of going fast, home computer drivers were ready for their first races. Reviewers rejoiced.
The way your car moved was silky smooth. The way other cars moved was just wonderful to watch.
Revs is in a completely different league to most racing games.
Things like the rearview mirrors revealing other racers coming up behind and the thump-thump as the cars run on the corner curbs.
It was the first racing game I ever played that had hills in it. The track went up and down as you drove around the circuit. After you'd seen that, there was no going back really.
Revs was unrivaled in many technical aspects in its quest for racing realism. Jeff Crammond brought together many new, never-before-seen features to build what he believed to be a complete simulator. For instance, Revs simulated the starting and stalling of the engine, accurate shifting of gears and power band horsepower, aerodynamic simulations reflecting wing angles and speed influence, self-centering caster steering force, accurate countersteering and spin correction. And your car could even get airborne over a curve and fly off the track, ending your race as quickly as it began. A realistic penalty for exceeding the limit. And although many's first hours were simply spent in practice mode, lapping the circuit, it was competition mode that allowed the proficient to experience real racing competition. First, a selection of 3 difficulty modes, designed to ramp up the challenge, which controlled how fast realistic AI opponents would be on average. Novice still required consistency, but maybe forgave a more conservative heavy downforce setup. Amateur, a real racing challenge. And professional, only for the most optimized and experienced drivers. The AI themselves were groundbreaking. They were each given racing-themed names and personalities, injecting a small bit of humor and personalization into the sim. AI's performance remained consistent from race to race, enough to give you an idea of who you were racing against, even if they were just a few pixels. From the front of the grid with Max Throttle and Johnny Turbo, to the mid-pack battles with Glorious Slap and Huge Engine, and to the back, Peter out and miles behind bringing up the rear. Each race was an exciting battle to collect points. Races could be run in 5, 10, or 20 lap increments, and if the player made it to the finish line, a tournament-style championship points table created a sense of progression. The sim even featured multiplayer racing in a round-robin format, not uncommon for the time. Each player qualified individually and then race one by one, the game itself simulating the other player's attempt to race against, and compared statistics such as fast lap and total race time to determine the winner. It was clear that Revs was unlike any other games before it, and Jeff Crammond created something new, a true racing simulator for the home computer. For some, driving laps and trying to gain the extra tenth of a second lap after lap, hour after hour, was all that was needed. Tuning wing settings to extract the perfect degree of top speed and cornering performance. All of the elements for a compelling simulator were there. The racing sim was born. Revs was a success, and word quickly spread about Acorn Soft's programming wizard Jeff Crammond and his unbelievable new simulator. With the hard work out of the way, Jeff Crammond set out to increase the scope of Revs. In 1985, Acorn Soft released Revs 4-Track for the BBC Micro. A standalone game rather than an add-on, this pack featured the same core Formula 3 simulator, but with 4 new classic British circuits and the same stunning detail to race on. Donington, Snetterton, Oulton Park and Brands Hatch allowed simmers to experience the best Britain had to offer, in the majority of the real British F3 calendar. But plans for more extended well beyond circuit editions. With the success of the sim on the BBC Micro, Acorn Soft knew they had a hit on their hands, and immediately looked for ways to increase the software's reach and sales. Work began on a port to the more globally successful but less powerful Commodore 64. Jeff refined the code in an effort to optimize it for the less powerful system. Due to the slower hardware, it wasn't uncommon for ports to the Commodore to look and perform much worse than their original counterparts, but Crammond, unwilling to sacrifice the experience, employed novel, cutting-edge techniques to utilize the Commodore's graphics hardware to share the load of physics processing. Calculations for physics were actually output to text on the screen for the CPU to read. Their color matched to the same shade of blue as the sky, the trick obscuring text and making players none the wiser. But he pulled it off, allowing the sim to perform admirably on the lesser hardware. Revs was released to the Commodore 64 in 1986, published by Firebird, complete with a snazzy new intro. Although the frame rate was slightly lower in spots, it more than adequately delivered the same thrilling experience BBC Micro users had been enjoying. The Commodore 64 version featured 2 tracks, Silverstone and Brands Hatch, a nice upgrade to the solitary circuit of the original micro release. Back on the Beeb, Acornsoft released an update that would become the definitive edition of the simulator. 1986's Rev's 5-track most obviously added Silverstone back into the mix, allowing the user to race on all tracks in one disc. But there was one additional feature not noticed by many. Computer-assisted steering, or CAS, was added to the sim in response to those struggling navigating the circuits with a keyboard's digital input. A halfway step between player control and computer-guided steering, CAS was described as a hand on the steering wheel. The manual read, "It's still up to you to get your speed and position correct as you approach each bend," but CAS filled in the detail and simulated analog movement from simple key presses, smoothing the player's inputs and helping guide them along. A step away from the hard realism Kremen strove for, but a quality of life improvement for sure. CAS became a staple in the next decade of simulators. One last version, in 1987, Revs Plus, was released on the Commodore 64. The most complete edition yet, incorporating all the updates from all other versions, the sim featured 6 tracks, the 5 previously released, plus an exclusively brand new redone 1985 German Nürburgring GP circuit. Quite the collection, indeed. And just like that, the world was racing at their computers, studying braking markers, searching for tenths of a second, battling the competition, enabling thousands to live out their racing fantasies from the driver's seat, only virtually. It's tough to say if another developer or another sim would have come along and fit in Rev's place. Jeff Crammond, with his physics degree and curious spirit, seemed uniquely qualified to deliver an experience so detailed, so early on. Only an experienced programmer such as himself could harness the meager 8-bit home computers of the time through assembly code to optimize experiences so beautifully. Revs is somewhat forgotten in sim racing because of all that came later, but it's important to remember how it all began. Revs was a revolution, but things were just getting started. The year was 1984. Crude to modernize, but spectacle galore. Simulation unmatched, the need for speed quenched. A sign of things to come. Just wait for 1991.